Welcome, everybody. I'm Dan Brown, the director of the SEFS, and I want to start by acknowledging, although not all of us are on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands of the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I am, and many of us are, and so welcome virtually to these lands that we occupy. And I'm really pleased to welcome Ruth DeFries, who's a professor of ecology and sustainable development at Columbia University in New York. And I've had the honor and pleasure to know you for many years, and I'm glad that we're able to catch up virtually a little bit here. By way of introduction, Ruth uses images from satellites and field surveys to examine how the world's demands for food and other resources are changing land use throughout the tropics. Her research quantifies how these land use changes affect climate, biodiversity, and other ecosystem services, as well as human development. She has also developed innovative education programs in sustainable development. Ruth was elected as a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, one of the country's highest scientific honors, received a MacArthur Genius Award, and is the recipient of many honors for her scientific research. In addition to over 100 scientific papers, she's committed to communicating the nuances and complexities of sustainable development to popular audiences through her books, The Big Ratchet, How Humanity Thrives in the Face of Natural Crisis, and the most recent, which I think we're going to hear about today, is What Would Nature Do? A Guide for Our Uncertain Times. So thank you. Join me in welcoming Ruth DeFries.
Hey, well, thank you so much. I wish we were there in person, but this will have to do. So it's great to be with you. Are you seeing the right thing?
It looks good to me.
Okay, great, thanks. So what I'm going to try to do today is a little bit different than a standard research talk. And that is to share with you some ideas from this new book that Dan just mentioned, and to interweave some research that relates to the topic of the book, which is more place-based. So the place you are seeing here, which is in central India, where I do a lot of my research, and the book is more sort of abstract ideas kind of thinking. And the book is addressing how we might think about learning from nature's strategies to get us through these uncertain times that we are living through. And I actually finished this book a little over a year ago, just around last March. So we're all familiar with what was happening last March before the pandemic hit. So, you know, there it was, the proof that uncertain things can happen and society is sometimes not prepared to deal with them. So over the last year, there's many examples of the uncertainties that we face in our human constructed world. A recent example is the blockage of the Suez Canal, which is so important for trade. About 12% of global trade goes through the Suez Canal. And it was a couple of weeks that tanker blocked the Suez Canal, and it was able to get lodged free when there was a high tide, and allow ships to pass through. So that's, you know, maybe it was predictable that such a thing would happen at some point, but when and where exactly is not quite predictable. Maybe some of you were in Texas, where we had that really difficult stretch from extreme cold event and snow, very uncertain, and very Texas is not used to dealing with that, and we all know what happened sadly with the power grid and the hardship that a lot of people went through during that uncertain episode. In the last year, we've also had quite a lot of fires out in your part of the world if you're in Western North America, and we can expect more of that with increasing temperature combined with fire suppression over the last century. When and where exactly those fires will occur, a bit uncertain. And of course, the biggest uncertainty of all that has faced us in the last year is the pandemic. And again, infectious disease experts have been predicting that something like this could happen at some point, but exactly when, where, how it plays out, highly uncertain in the complex world that we live in. And all of these uncertainties become more and more consequential as our world becomes more urban, which means more interconnected, which means all places in the world are depending on other places, and more complex. And it could be that if coronavirus was in a market in Asia somewhere, that if it were not for our interconnected world, that it might not, well, it certainly would not have been able to spread around the world in such a matter of days and cause such an enormous catastrophe for the world. So we live in this very interconnected, complex world. The world is more urban than it has ever been before. This is very new in the timeline of human experience. So we are so interconnected. And in every sense, in the formal definition of complex systems, our human constructed world is a complex system. So we can think about simple systems and complex systems being governed by the interaction among the parts and feedbacks and nonlinearities, which result in unpredictable outcomes, inherent lack of predictability. But we've tended to think about the world and address our problems as if we lived in a simple system. And certainly that kind of thinking has taken us very far with vaccines and synthetic fertilizers and hybrid seeds and all of the great technological advances of the last century or so, which is sort of on the premise that we live in a simple system. We have a technical solution and we apply it and we can predict the outcomes. The world we live in now is very different, very complex, although I'm not against technical advances, but how they play out is really unpredictable. And how are we going to learn to live in this world now, where human decisions affect so much of the world that we live in? So that's what I was trying to think about in this book, and using the analogy of nature as a complex system. There's no more complex system than nature, which with interacting parts and nonlinearities and feedbacks and all of those features of complex systems, and thinking about what can we learn from nature in terms of the strategies that have evolved in nature, not by intentional design, but have made it possible for life to persist for billions and billions of years, when you could imagine many times when life could have come to an end on Earth and not have the complex nature that we have today. So are there things that we can learn? Are there strategies at a sort of systemic level where we can learn from nature? So what the book does is it goes through 4 of these strategies that have some kind of implications for how humans might manage their own affairs. So I'm going to quickly go through those 4 strategies and then try to weave in some research along the way. So the first strategy is about networks. Networks are so fundamental to both nature and to human civilization. In human civilization, through trade, through communication networks, through the transfer of ideas, networks are just so so much a part of our modern civilization. And networks are also critical to many aspects of nature. Let's just focus in on a leaf vein. And if you pick up a leaf vein and look at it very carefully, you will see a network of leaf veins. And that network is essential to carry water throughout the leaf and carry sugars back to the plant, and throughout nature, through our brains, and so many systems in nature rely on the movement of materials through a network. So the earliest kinds of leaf veins, the ginkgo tree, the oldest primitive tree, had leaf vein networks which seemed like they'd be efficient, but over time some leaf veins evolved to something quite different. So you can see here an early ginkgo leaf where you don't have this kind of loopy redundancy in the network. If you look at a leaf of an angiosperm, you'll see leaf veins that just seem to sort of not have any particular pattern and pretty inefficient, and leaf veins just looping around on each other. And physicists have done some really interesting work about the advantages of this kind of structure. It seems inefficient because the leaf needs to, or the plant needs to invest energy and materials in building that leaf vein. But the advantage comes when there's some damage to the leaf, like an insect bite here. This is a kale leaf from my garden. You can see insect bites there, where if there's a bite taken out of the leaf, because of that loopy vein structure, there's multiple ways to get from point A to point B. So nature's strategy, again, not intentionally, has evolved to invest in some inefficiency to be able to be resilient to damage, whether it's an insect bite or wind or some kind of damage. So this has some implications for our human constructed world, and people have, in some spheres, realized this and adopted this kind of strategy of redundancy in networks over time. And this kind of thinking is critical to the development of the internet. So Paul Barron was an engineer during the Cold War, and he was working for the Rand Corporation, and his job as a young engineer was to advise the Defense Department and AT&T on the communications network strategy that would be resilient to an attack. So the thinking at that time was a kind of centralized hub and spoke strategy, that there's a central command center. Paul Barron worked on this problem and recommended something very different, that some resilience to attack. So the problem is, if there's an attack on the hub, then the whole thing comes down. The whole communications network comes down. So Paul Barron recommended that this kind of more decentralized strategy could confer some resilience to attack, but that this distributed network, which looks quite analogous to a leaf vein, Paul Barron probably didn't really look at leaf veins, but he came up with this same strategy, that some redundancy in the network, and this loopy kind of network where there's multiple options to get from one place to another place, would be the most resilient to attack at any point in the network. And it would involve some extra investment in these communication lines, but it would confer resilience. He presented this idea and he was laughed out of the room. He was not taken seriously at all. But he continued to work on this, and over time, the prototype, the people who were working on the prototype internet came up across his ideas, and this became really the basis of the internet. So in some spheres, our experimentation has gotten us to the same place as leaf veins and evolution. Similarly, in engineering, The idea of redundancy in engineering is very standard. I don't think any of us would want to get on a jetliner unless there were some redundancy in engineering. And that is, of course, there's extra cost involved. So that's very standard kind of thinking. It was not always so. But then when it comes to other aspects of our human constructed world, we still don't have a lot of redundancy. In fact, going in the other direction of less redundant networks in, for instance, our global food trade. So if we look at the global food trade, here's where food moves around the world, and you can see a couple of hubs, as in South America, in the Midwest, a couple of hubs that are feeding or exporting to many different countries. This looks a bit like what Paul Barron would not think was a great resilient network strategy for communications. And our global food trade has become more and more concentrated over time in terms of the way food is traded and moves around the world. So it's going in the opposite direction. Now that's may be very efficient, and economists would tell us that's very efficient because food is produced where it's most productive and cheapest to produce, and then export it to the places where it would be harder to produce that food. And indeed, this is getting to some of our research on this question, is that indeed this global food trade is efficient, not just in terms of moving tons of food, but also in terms of moving nutrients for human consumption. So we did an analysis a couple of years ago, led by Steve Wood, who's now at Yale, asking the question that does trade lead to trade of food around the world? Does lead to a less equitable distribution of nutrients? In this case, you can see the nutrients here on the x-axis, or more equitable. And I went into this thinking that that lower income countries are producing nutritious foods, fruits and vegetables, and nutritious foods, and sort of trading away their nutrients and leading to a less equitable distribution, where the rich countries are getting the benefit and the poor countries are losing their nutrients, kind of like the idea of virtual water trade. What we found was something really opposite from that, that if we compare our world with trade, the way it is currently, and with the production systems that we currently have, and without trade, we see using the Gini coefficient as a measure of the equity of nutrient distribution, we see a less equitable world without trade. So that surprised me. Maybe it shouldn't have surprised me, but we see here again in kind of map form that the countries that are in bluish tones are providing the energy and the iron to many, many other countries. So that seems positive, and that's efficient, and that may be true in a static world. But we don't live in a static world. We live in a very volatile world. And does that kind of efficient but fragile network, sort of that hub and spoke sort of model, or that decentralized model, a little bit decentralized, but basically a hub and spoke sort of model, how does that hold up in a dynamic world where food prices are fluctuating all the time? So we saw what happens in a dynamic world when the fragile network of the global food trade was disrupted by a couple of droughts in the food producing parts of the world, and which led to price spikes this happened in 2008 and 2011, and it will undoubtedly happen again at some point. And what makes this a complex system is that not only did the prices of food, or grains in particular, increase because the production was lower, but the reaction of the exporting countries was to restrict their exports, which led to higher price spikes, and then just these positive feedbacks in a negative sense, an unfortunate sense, which led to more and more increase in prices, which led to food riots in urban areas around the world, where people, low-income people will spend some enormous amount, upwards of 80% of their income on food, and some say led to was a factor in the Arab Spring, which of course changed geopolitics around the world. So now, thinking about how do we introduce some redundancy in the networks which are highly concentrated, like the global food trade. And there has been so much thinking about this from the pandemic, when supply chains, the danger of sole sourcing and having efficient but concentrated sources for all kinds of things. Remember the hand sanitizer and the toilet paper and the PPE and all of that, those discussions now, which has really changed the thinking. I think we'll see how it lasts in the long term, about the wisdom, like a leaf vein, of introducing redundancy into networks. So that's one strategy that we can think about from nature, how it applies to our human constructed world. Another strategy, of course, is diversity. Diversity is any ecologist will tell you, just the fundamental feature of nature. And we have millions and millions. We don't even know how many species we have in the world. But somehow it again, not in an intentional sense, somehow it pays off for, or it has shown to be beneficial for nature to have all of those options alive through the diversity of different species, diversity of genetic diversity within individuals, and diversity of different taxa. So if we look through the long geologic record, we see that diversity has really made it possible for life to persist when there have been asteroids crashing into the earth and extinctions and diseases which take out some species, that there are other species that can take its place. So this is a very, ecologists talk about this all the time, the insurance value of diversity. And in human systems have, again, learned this lesson quite well and won Nobel Prizes off of it. Again, maybe not making the analogy with nature, but how this strategy is beneficial. And investors are very well aware of the idea of diversified portfolios and diversified bet hedging, where the idea is not only to have a diversity in investments, but diversity in types of investments, so that if there is a shock to one type of investment, maybe in this case railroads or mining or whatever that shock is, that there is diversified portfolio of types of investments, and a shock will not bring all of the investments down at the same time. Sort of the idea of functional diversity in ecology. So this concept is very well embedded in finance, but again, in our food systems, less going in the other direction, like the concentration of the food trade, where our diets that feed humanity are more and more concentrated in a few, like handful of species. So it's quite amazing that 17 foods make up 75% of the global food supply, and 3, wheat, rice, and maize, make up over 50% of calories that feed humanity. So this strategy from nature might tell us that some investment in keeping the diversity of the plants that we rely on to feed humanity might pay off at some point. And I will then share with you some research results going back to work in India, where we've seen that diversity reducing over time. This is one of the aspects of the Green Revolution. So there's positives and negatives of the Green Revolution, where there was a huge increase in yield. So we can talk about that afterwards. But the investment was on the increasing yields for rice and wheat. So there are a lot of many different varieties and different cereals that have been in the diet for a very long time in that part of the world. And the increase from the Green Revolution going back to the 60s was to increase these rice and wheat, these C3 cereals, at the expense proportionately of the traditional cereals, which are generally well adapted to dry conditions, poor soils, and most importantly, highly nutritious. So these C4 cereals have, if we look at the nutritional content, you'll see that they have a lot more iron, zinc, different micronutrients, and they have reduced in the production systems and therefore in the consumption of what people are eating. So that would be fine if there was some other items in the diets that compensated for the loss of those micronutrients that people were getting in these traditional cereals, but that has generally not been the case. We see here that calories, because these different cereals are pretty much the same in terms of calories, that stayed pretty constant. Amazing achievement, incredible achievement of the Green Revolution on a per capita basis, so even with an increase in the population. But when you look at the micronutrients like iron, there's been a decrease over time. And this is going in the wrong direction. This is not what we want to see, because anemia, iron deficient anemia, is a big problem, particularly for women and children. And we see here a pretty sharp decline in iron consumption. This is based on data from the Indian government, which is incredibly extensive survey data about consumption of as many food items as you could possibly think of. And what we see here is that over time, the rural poor that previously, if we go back a couple of decades, had a reasonably, still deficient, but a iron consumption, per capita iron consumption on par with the urban wealthy, and that has declined quite rapidly. So we did a deep dive, and I'll just want to acknowledge my colleagues here. We did a really deep dive into this question about, is it possible, and what would be the trade-offs in trying to bring back the traditional cereals, not because they're romantic or all those kinds of things you read about, but because would there be an advantage in terms of saving water, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of the production of nutrients for human diets, and in terms of energy use. So I'm going to show you a very complicated diagram, but the point here is, from this optimization, that we ask the question, if you put those traditional cereals back in the places that they were historically grown, would it be possible to not reduce total production in terms of calories, not add more cropped area, because there isn't any more cropped area to add? What would be the outcome for different dimensions of protein, iron, irrigation, so water demand, energy demand, greenhouse gas production, and climate resilience, because these traditional cereals are more resilient to climate variability than rice and wheat, which have sort of taken over the production and consumption systems. So if you see here, the dotted line is the current situation, and we see here that if we put back with two different ways of doing it, We have a sort of proteins taste about the same. Iron increases a lot, irrigation decreases, energy decreases, greenhouse gases decrease because rice is a big methane producer, and resilience generally increases. So the bottom line of this analysis is that keeping production constant and crop area constant, and strategically having those traditional cereals grown in places where it makes sense to grow them, it's mostly win-wins for nutrition and environmental dimensions, with no loss in production or needing more land. So this seems to be a good idea, and in fact, this is quite an issue that has really taken off in India. And there is not because of our research, we just contributed to the whole dialogue about the benefits of these, what are now called by the Indian government as nutri-cereals. They used to be very low status, and they still are in many people's eyes. But there is this if you go into high-end grocery stores and high-end restaurants, you will see these traditional cereals, very beautifully packed, expensive. But what we really want to see is that these traditional cereals can get to the rural poor who were at the losing end of the decline of these traditional cereals. And what I'm showing you here is a ration shop, basically, that is part of the public distribution system, the biggest safety net in the world, where cereals and kerosene and some items are distributed at a highly subsidized rate to below poverty income households. And that has been rice and wheat. Some states now are starting to introduce the traditional cereal. So this idea has really taken off. And basically the idea is to bring back the diversity in cereals. So where it makes sense to grow these cereals, traditional cereals, which is not everywhere, but in the drier parts of the country, to increase the diversity, as nature has shown us is not a bad idea. So that's strategy number 2. Strategy number 3, so in the book, there's a chapter for each one of these strategies, is to think about this idea of this incredible ability of so many systems in nature to self-correct. So everything from predator-prey dynamics to the long-term cycling of carbon that has kept our climate fairly stable over very, very long times because of the negative feedback or the self-correcting mechanism in the carbon cycle, where higher temperatures means more CO2 gets pulled out of the atmosphere because there's more evaporation, and vice versa. When it's colder, less gets pulled out. So we have this kind of homeostasis, and nature is full of examples of homeostasis, and human physiology is full of examples, such as blood sugar regulation in our bodies. So nature, through evolution, has developed, again, not intentionally, but because it works, these self-correcting kinds of mechanisms. Again, in the finance world, the finance regulators have introduced this kind of self-regulation idea in the stock market, and this is the circuit breakers that we know. If you think back to last March and remember when the stock market started to tank and these circuit breakers tripped, and they kept tripping over and over again. These are the circuit breakers that go automatically halt trade if the stock market declines too rapidly, and that halt gives some opportunity for the stock market to stabilize. And you can see this is what's known as the flash crash that happened in 2010, where there was a sharp decline, the circuit breaker trip and halted trading for a bit, and seconds or minutes, and then the market stabilized. Otherwise, perhaps the stock market would have continued to tank without that self-regulating, again, introduced by finance regulators. after the after Black Monday, which was in 1987, October 1987. So not that long ago. So the finance world has taken on this idea of the benefits to be gotten from some self-regulation or self-regulating mechanisms that, of course, are tuned over and over as nature has done over time as they learn with each crisis. So there's other self-regulating features in nature that that we haven't quite, that we've kind of ignored, and one of them is related to the fires. So if we think about the what happened when European forestry met fire-prone areas or fire-adapted areas like Western North America, that the idea from European forestry was that fires are just bad. There was a 10 a.m. policy in the Forest Service that said fire should be put out by 10 a.m. the next day, and we just don't want fires. Now, we know now that that kind of ignoring that self-regulating feedback leads to dangerous fires, because the regulating feedback is that the fuel load builds up, and then there's a fire which cuts back the fuel load until it builds up again, because there's always ignition sources somewhere, sometime, and that keeps the fires from becoming too big and dangerous. So what we've seen recently, and also with climate change in the mix, is that we have big, dangerous fires that would at least be less dangerous were it not for that suppression of fuel loads. And indigenous populations who managed fires for many, many millennia managed with small fires that kept the big fires in check. So the Forest Service did away with the 10 a.m. policy not all that long ago, and recognizing the value that indigenous fire management knew and nature tells us is beneficial for our ability to persist on this planet. This is the last strategy, and this is the idea that from nature is the value of decisions that are made by individuals who are in the closest position to observe their local surroundings and make decisions accordingly. So Eleanor Ostrom, the wonderful work of Eleanor Ostrom, found that there are many examples where people can manage their own resources from a bottom-up, self-organizing kind of strategy. Not always, but Eleanor Ostrom identified those wonderful 8 design principles that make it possible for self-organizing behavior that leads to effective management of resources. And what's so fantastic, this is my favorite chapter in the book, because Eleanor Ostrom, who ended up winning the Nobel Prize, first woman, and she wasn't even an economist, she was a political scientist, just went head to head with the dogma of the day, which came from Garrett Hardin and the Tragedy of the Commons, which is the idea that people will trash their common resources unless there is top-down control, regulation. And Eleanor Ostrom countered that idea that it is possible for people to manage their resources from the bottom up. And this is very much what we see in nature. You don't really see central control. We might think about the queen in the middle of an ant's nest as directing all the individuals. It sure looks like that when you see ants marching in a line, but that's not what's going on at all. The queen has absolutely no power over where the individual ants go. The ants are observing their local surrounding. They are picking up on the pheromones that is left by the ant that is just in front of them, and they are leaving pheromones for the ants that are behind them, and that results in this emergent property of a straight line. So we don't really see that kind of top-down control of Garrett Hardin, the tragedy of the commons kind of thinking in nature, which suggests to us that there might be some kind of benefit. Of course, people are not ants, and we don't want people to be following pheromones and just, people have ideas, and but the principle still holds. And we see this principle, we've seen it in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where there has been just decades and decades of trying to figure out how countries can come together to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And for many decades, the approach was thinking about the atmosphere as a pie and divide up the pie, and different countries can emit different amounts into the atmosphere, very kind of top-down kind of thinking. And that kind of fell apart in Copenhagen, if you remember back to those times. And the success of the Paris Agreement was the first time that countries actually agreed on reducing emissions. We all know that's insufficient, and even if countries lived up to their commitments, it would not be enough to solve the climate problem. But it's the first time that countries actually agreed. And the strategy was opposite from that kind of top-down divide up the pie. It was each country bring to the table what they can commit to based on their own situations and their own understanding of how much they could reduce their emissions. And that led to some agreement. So this is one thing we learned from nature, that individuals who can base their decisions based on they are the closest to understand what is possible for them. Of course, not all decisions or organization in human society can be bottom up. We need some top down, like investment in vaccines and so on. But when it comes to thinking about how we manage our resources and how leadership can cultivate self-organization and bottom up decisions where that is appropriate, where people are in the best position to understand their local situation. So those were the 4 kinds of strategies that I pulled out and tried to describe in this book. Maybe you could have another different kind of list of what we can learn from nature that might help us move forward in this very uncertain, very complex world, where the kind of simple solution, technological fix kind of idea is perhaps appropriate for some aspects of human civilization, but where this sort of thinking about complexity and what strategies have worked in a complex system might help us with a path forward. So just to give the same point from the West and from the East, that we live in an incredibly complex world, and it requires a different kind of thinking about how humans organize themselves and persist through the uncertainty that is ahead of us. So with that, I thank you, and I think I'll stop sharing. Shall I stop sharing, Dan?
Sure.
There we go. Okay.
All right. That's pretty cool tour to nature.
Let me just say also that I tried to make the book, you can be the judge, but I tried to make it fun and readable and full of stories and things.
So there's one question in the chat, but I want to ask one sort of broader, overarching question about, okay, this book, you put the final touches on it, the pandemic happens. What did you see over the last year that made you think, oh, here's how what happened relates to these lessons that I pulled out?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking about that all year. And, I was just sending in the final manuscript last March, and then I had to just scramble and put in some things about the pandemic. So there's a little bit in there, but, a lot. So the one is about there's been so much discussion now about redundancy in supply chains. So that that fits with chapter 2. There's, I often think about the bottom up, chapter 5, that kind of thinking, whether, some top down investments are certainly required in human civilization, but whether this is probably not even realistic, but whether local communities could have, with the right information and non-politicized information, if they could come together and decide for themselves how they could best stop the spread of COVID, would we have seen a different outcome? And I saw this in India because when this COVID happened, when the pandemic broke out, I was just like, oh my God, if this gets into the villages in India, it's just like hellish, because there is very poor health infrastructure. So I was like, oh my God. So I just to keep my own sanity, not to help anybody, I did some epidemiology modeling and looked at the spread and how the spread could best be contained in villages. And sort of the obvious came out, that if villages just, like a group of villages just continues to interact among themselves, but keep out, but isolate themselves, kind of the pod idea of families and friends, then that would reduce the spread better than if there was sort of less interaction and not cutting off the village. And that is what villages did. They did that at the beginning. Now we'll see with this second wave, which is quite scary. But that's what they did, and there was not. I'm not sure it was because of that, but maybe there was not this just explosion throughout rural India like was originally feared. So that's a kind of a chapter 5 thinking.
It's interesting to think about it. You wonder if the top down was the problem. This is sort of the politicized information was coming from the top.
Yeah. We could talk about that all day, couldn't we?
Yeah. We have one question from the first section about the food trade and the effects on nutrient equity and what role soil depletion might play in that. And I guess maybe that's connected partly to the specialization and intensification in some areas, and is there a diversification effect there on reduced degradation?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, because one of the things I've been wondering, I am not equipped to answer it, but Steve Wood, who did that original work, is now looking at this question about how much the nutrients in soil affect the nutrients in the crops that are grown. It seems like that's something we should know, but we don't really. So he's looking into that question. But the spread of rice and wheat in places where these traditional cereals were historically grown, which is in the drier areas with poor soils, that requires well, for the wheat requires irrigation, and for the rice requires fertilizer to get the yields up. So the Green Revolution was like a whole package of fertilizer, irrigation, hybrid seeds. So to the extent that that it enabled increasing yields, that's good, but also because of continued use of synthetic fertilizer and less of the rotation of crops, there's a lot of depleted soil.
Yep. So any other questions? I don't have any more in the chat or Q&A. I know there's a bunch of people listening. Anybody want to ask any more questions for Ruth? I guess I might ask for those of us, some of us know you from your work applying remote sensing to understanding food systems. How did remote sensed observations of agricultural systems figure into some of that work that you were doing?
Well, yeah, a lot of the examples and research for the book is around food systems and how these strategies apply to food systems. So certainly the remote sensing and the sort of top-down look at the world has led me to think about what avenues might lead to more sustainable food systems than we currently have. But still that ability to look at the world from the top is just amazing. It just gives us a perspective that is just like no other. But also the time perspective is where I started also with this book, the time perspective of evolution and billions of years where life has persisted. How is that? It's just, how is it that life has persisted through all of these shocks that could have been the end? And so the combination of that spatial perspective and time perspective is what I think led to thinking about this book.
So here's a really interesting question from a student who says, "Thank you, I love your work," but also you're essentially, you don't use the term, but to me it seems like it's a biomimicry sort of description of mimicking social systems off of biological systems and life and nature generally, more broadly. And Catherine's question is, how do we incorporate these strategies into our science and into the scientific method?
Oh, what a wonderful question. So first to the biomimicry. Yes, it is biomimicry at a systems level.
Yeah.
So a lot of the biomimicry has been around materials like Velcro, from that sort of thing. But this is biomimicry at a systems. So I love that question about how we think about this as in our science, and I think it fits in with so much discussion that's going on now, all in a great direction as far as I'm concerned, about co-production and incorporating a diversity of views and how important that is to understand the world. So there's a lot around co-production and incorporating traditional knowledge, and that is getting at the diversity question. Self-regulating, I guess you'd say that's the dreaded peer review process, which is painful when you're going through it, but it is the big self-correcting mechanism in science, and I guess you'd say in politics, it's elections, maybe, if they're fair, people can vote.
Some disciplines are having significant conversations, even crises, around replication, which is and replicability of science, which is kind of a discussion about self-correction.
Yeah.
If we can't replicate it, how can we verify that what we know is what we know?
Right. But it has, I think, that self-correcting feature of in science, of the peer review process, has served science really pretty well. There can be individual mistakes along the way, but over time they will be corrected.
I would think the networks analogy works as well. That more connected network, a less closed kind of hub and spoke model, allows for more voices, more co-production, more dissemination.
Open access.
Yeah.
And also to have backup plans, to always have backup plans for your research. If something doesn't work out, you can try something else.
Right. Interesting. Any other questions before we move on? We're just getting towards the end of time, so time for one more if anybody has one. Well, not seeing one, I'm going to take a moment and thank you again for taking the time to share this really interesting big picture book in a way that helps us look at our social systems differently. And I really appreciate your sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I would just say, if anyone is interested in this kind of popular science writing, and not everyone needs to be or should be interested in it, I just find it fun and challenging. Don't be afraid of it. It's fun. It's different, completely different than writing a scientific paper, but it's fun.
So with it, there's a whole set of questions there. How do you come to take on a project like this?
Well, I got the popular science bug a couple of decades ago, and I worked with a science writer on a book that I did a long time ago called One Earth, One Future, and that gave me the bug. That it's a challenge. It really is a challenge, if you're used to writing scientific papers, because you have to completely flip. I mean, the way we write our scientific papers is you build up to your conclusion, and you just kind of have to flip that around. And I find it fun and challenging to try to find the narratives to illustrate a point. When we're used to thinking data to provide evidence for a point. Here, the challenge is to find a narrative that illustrates. So
it must be satisfying to have these points and then be able to bring it back to your own papers and say, here's an example from my own work, which you did today, I thought, nicely. It started with a big general point and then worked into the research that you've been working on.
Thanks.